said it every time they chose my brother over me. So one day I just stopped showing up. Now they're the ones standing on my doorstep begging for help, and I just smile and say, "You'll be fine. You always are." The phone lit up on the podium beside me, face down, buzzing like a trapped wasp. It was 9:52 on a Thursday night, and I was 3 sentences from the biggest moment of my professional life. 200 people in that hotel ballroom, a screen the size of a garage door behind me, my company's name glowing across it in letters I still couldn't believe were mine. I'd rehearsed this speech in the shower, in the car, in my sleep, and the moment I opened my mouth to deliver the line I'd saved for last, the phone buzzed. I glanced down. The screen glowed with a single word, "Mom." I let it go. It buzzed again before the first vibration had even finished. Insistent, relentless, the way it always was. A perfect little metaphor for the last 30 years of my life. I finished my speech. I got my applause. I shook the hands. And then I stepped into the hallway, away from the noise, and I called her back, because that is what I had always done. Because some reflexes are carved so deep into you that they feel like breathing. "Reed," she said, and there was no hello. No "how did it go tonight?" No "I'm proud of you." There never was. "Reed, thank God, it's your brother. Colton's in trouble again, and your father and I have talked about it, and we think, well, we know you're doing so well now. We think you're the only one who can help." I stood in that hallway with the muffled sound of my own celebration leaking through the door behind me, and I asked the question I already knew the answer to. "How much?" She told me the number. I won't repeat it here because the number was never the point. The number was just the price of admission to a show I'd been buying tickets to my entire life. I said I'd think about it. She said, "And I will remember this until the day I die." She said, "Oh, don't overthink it, sweetheart. You'll be fine. You always are." And then she hung up to go handle the crisis, and I stood there holding a dead phone, listening to the ghost of applause on the other side of a door, wearing the nicest suit I had ever owned, feeling like the poorest man alive. "You'll be fine. You always are." I had heard that sentence 1,000 times. It was the lullaby of my childhood and the eulogy of my adult life. But that night, standing in that hallway, it landed differently. It didn't sting. It thudded. A dull, sickening, final thud, like a coffin lid closing, like a door being nailed shut from the outside. And in that thud, I finally understood something I'd spent 3 decades refusing to see. That sentence was not a compliment. It had never been a compliment. It was a permission slip. It was the thing they said to excuse themselves from ever having to show up for me, because a man who is always fine is a man you never have to worry about, a man you can drain without guilt, a man whose tank you assume is bottomless because you have never once bothered to check the gauge. I drove home that night with the radio off, and somewhere on the highway, with the city lights sliding past like they were being poured out behind me, the camera in my head finally pulled back, and I saw the whole thing, not as a family, as a machine, and I was the part buried underground, the one nobody ever admired, the one expected to bear the entire weight of the structure in the dark, silent and load-bearing and utterly, completely invisible. Here is the thing about being the strong one. It sounds like a compliment, and that's the trap of it. That's the elegant cruelty of the whole design. When they tell you you're the strong one, you hear that you're valued. What they actually mean is that you're the one whose pain doesn't count. Strength, in a family like mine, is not a thing they admire in you. It's a permission they grant themselves. It's the excuse that lets them pour every drop of care and worry and attention into someone else, because you, the strong one, will be fine. You always are. You don't need it the way he does. And the horrible genius of it is that the more you carry, the more proof you provide that you can carry it, and the more you can carry, the less anyone believes you could ever need carrying yourself. Competence becomes a prison. The reward for holding everything up is that no one ever asks if you're tired, and you learn, without ever being told in words, that your needs are an inconvenience and your strength is a resource, and you file yourself away accordingly, in the dark, under the floor, holding up a house full of people who have genuinely never wondered whether the floor gets tired of being stood on. I was 32 before I understood that I was allowed to get tired. That's not an exaggeration. 32 years old, running a company, and it had genuinely never occurred to me that "you'll be fine" was a thing that could be false, that I was permitted to not be fine, that being the strong one did not obligate me to be strong for people who had never once been strong for me. The night of the award, in that hallway, holding that dead phone, was the night the permission slip finally expired. And once it expired, I could not renew it, and I did not want to, and everything that followed flowed from that single, quiet, 32 years late realization that I was a person, not a pillar, and that a person is allowed to walk out of a house he spent his whole life holding up. Let me back up. Let me show you the machine. There were 2 of us, me and Colton, 3 years younger, born golden. I don't mean that as a figure of speech. I mean that from the moment my brother arrived, he was treated like a visiting dignitary, and I was treated like the staff. It was subtle at first, the way these things always are, small enough that any single instance could be waved away, so that if you ever tried to point at it, you'd sound insane. He cried, and the whole house rearranged itself. I cried, and I was told big boys handle it. He got the last piece of anything worth wanting. I got told there was plenty to go around, which there never was. When I was 9, I made the honor roll for the first time. I ran the whole way home from the bus stop with the certificate held out in front of me like it was on fire, and I burst through the door, and my mother looked up from the kitchen table and said, "That's nice, honey, put it on the fridge," and went right back to helping Colton glue macaroni to a paper plate. The macaroni plate got framed. It hung in the hallway for a decade. My certificate fell behind the fridge sometime that winter, and nobody ever noticed it was gone, least of all me. I'd already learned the lesson. Effort was expected from me and celebrated in him. There was a science fair when I was 12. I built a working model of a hydroelectric dam, spent 3 weeks on it at the kitchen table after everyone had gone to bed, wired a little motor to a bulb so that when the water turned the wheel, an actual light came on. It won the regional. There was a ceremony, a Saturday morning in the school gym, and I'd told my parents about it a dozen times, and I stood up there when they called my name, and I looked out at the folding chairs, and the 2 seats I'd saved were empty. Colton had a pee-wee soccer game that morning. He was 6. He spent the entire game picking dandelions in the outfield, I heard later, and my father filmed all 40 minutes of it. My dam went into a cardboard box in the garage that afternoon, and I don't think it ever came out again. Somewhere in a landfill there is a small hydroelectric dam that once made a light come on, and the only person who ever saw it work was me. My birthday is a week after Colton's. That geographic accident of the calendar shaped my whole childhood, because every year, to be efficient, to be practical, my mother combined them. A joint party. Except a joint party for a 6-year-old and a 9-year-old is a 6-year-old's party with an older kid standing awkwardly at the edge of it. And a joint cake is a cake that says Colton's name in big frosting letters, and mine squeezed underneath in a smaller hand. An afterthought, a footnote, and joint presents are presents chosen for the little one, because he's the one who'll make a fuss if it's wrong. I learned very early not to make a fuss. Making a fuss was Colton's job, and he was so good at it that there was no room left for anyone else to try. When I was 15, I stayed after school for a debate tournament, and I called home for a ride when it ended, and no one answered, and I called again and again, standing under the awning by the gym doors while the rain came down in sheets, and the parking lot emptied out 1 car at a time until mine was the last face at the glass. I waited 2 hours, then I walked 3 miles in the rain, and when I finally came through the door soaked to the bone, my mother looked up, genuinely surprised, and said, "Oh, Reed, we forgot you were still there." Colton sprained his wrist at practice, and we had to take him to urgent care. It was chaos. A sprained wrist. They'd forgotten a living child existed because another child had a sprained wrist. And the thing is, I said it was fine. I remember saying it. I remember drying off and saying, "Don't worry about it. Is Colton okay?" Because even then, dripping on the kitchen tile, my first instinct was to make sure the golden one was all right. That instinct took me another 17 years to unlearn. I saved for a bike once, 2 summers of mowing lawns, a coffee can of crumpled bills in my closet, and I had almost enough, and I made the mistake of being proud of it out loud at dinner. And Colton, who was 10, decided that night that he wanted a bike too, and within a week there was 1 bike in the garage, new and gleaming, and it was his. And the reasoning, delivered by my mother as though it were obvious, was that Colton was too little to save up the way I had, and I was so good at saving that I could easily do it again, and wouldn't it be nice for me to see my little brother happy? I got the hand-me-down when he outgrew it, a year later, rusted at the chain. My coffee can of 2 summers went toward family expenses that were never itemized. I was 9, and I was already learning the central rule of the house, which was that anything I built could be reassigned to my brother at any time, because my competence was communal property and his desires were sacred. The one that still makes me laugh, in the dark way you laugh at old scars, was the Christmas I bought myself a book I'd wanted all year, a beautiful expensive thing about architecture, and I wrapped it and put it under the tree with my own name on it because I knew no one else would think to. A small private arrangement I'd made with myself for years, buying my own presents and pretending to be surprised. And on Christmas morning, my mother, running short 1 gift for a cousin's kid, picked up my wrapped book without checking the tag and handed it to the child, who tore it open and had no idea what it was and left it on the floor. I found it later under a pile of wrapping paper, the spine already cracked. I never said anything. I just took it up to my room and read it, cracked spine and all. I'd learned by then that the fastest way to lose a thing in that house was to let anyone know it mattered to me. By the time I was 12, I wasn't really a child anymore, not in the way that counts. I was the house's spare adult. When my parents fought, and they fought often and loudly, it was me who got Colton out of the room, me who turned the TV up so he wouldn't hear, me who sat with him and made it a game until the shouting stopped. When Colton got in trouble at school, it was me the office called because our parents were busy, and I was listed as the responsible party, a role I'd been assigned somewhere around age 10 without anyone asking. When there was a bill nobody wanted to open, or a form nobody wanted to fill out, or a hard phone call nobody wanted to make, it drifted, by a gravity as natural as water finding the low ground. To me, I was the one who remembered. I was the one who handled it. I was competent in the specific joyless way that children become competent when the adults around them have quietly decided that competence is a reason to hand them the weight, rather than a reason to lift some of it off. I never got to be the kid. Colton got to be the kid for both of us, permanently. Well into his 30s, 30s because somebody had to be the grown-up in that house, and everybody had already agreed, without a vote, that it was going to be me. I didn't resent Colton for getting the childhood. I just didn't understand for the longest time that I'd been robbed of my own, because you can't miss a thing you were never once allowed to have. When it came time for college, there was a conversation. I was in the next room, so I heard all of it. My father, in his reasonable voice, the one he used when he was about to be deeply unreasonable, explaining that money was tight, that they could really only do this properly for one of us, and that since I was, and I quote, so responsible, so self-sufficient, I would understand if they focused their resources on Colton, who needed more support. I was 17. I worked 2 jobs and took out loans and put myself through a state school while my parents wrote checks for my brother's private tuition, his fraternity dues, the apartment he needed because the dorms weren't a good fit for his temperament. And when I graduated, first in my family to ever do it, with a mountain of debt and a diploma I'd bled for, my parents didn't come. They couldn't. It was the same weekend as Colton's semester abroad send-off party, and someone had to be there to see him off. I walked at graduation alone. There's a photo of it somewhere. A stranger took it, me in my cap and gown holding the diploma, grinning like an idiot because I didn't yet know how to be sad about the empty seats, and there's no one in the frame but me. I keep that photo, not out of bitterness. Out of respect, I think, for the kid who did the whole thing himself and still found a way to smile. It didn't stop when we grew up. It just got more expensive. When I was 26, my cousin got married. A big wedding, 300 people, and I drove 4 hours to be there. And when I found the seating chart, I found my name at table 19, in the very back, at what was unmistakably the kids' table. Me, a grown man in a rented suit, seated between an 8-year-old with an iPad and a high chair. When I asked my mother about it, gently, she laughed and waved a hand and said, "Oh, you know how it is, sweetheart. We had to put Colton up front with the family because he gets so anxious in crowds, and you're just so easygoing, we knew you wouldn't mind. You're so easygoing. You wouldn't mind." It was the same sentence as "you'll be fine," wearing a different suit. My easygoingness was not a trait they admired. It was a resource they harvested. My whole life, the reward for never causing a problem was being treated like I didn't exist, and the reward for existing loudly, the way Colton did, was the head table. The year the company was still just an idea, I got an offer, a real one, a fellowship in another city, the kind of opportunity that comes once and changes the shape of a life. I was going to take it. And then Colton's second business folded, and there was a mess to clean up, a lease he'd personally guaranteed and couldn't pay, and my parents called frantic, and I was the only one with the money and the level head, and I told myself it was just a few months, just until things settled, and I turned the fellowship down. It never came around again. Opportunities like that don't wait for you to finish rescuing your brother. I don't know who I'd have become if I'd gone. I try not to think about him too much. That other Reed, the one who got to choose himself for once. He haunts the edges of me some nights, but he's quieter now than he used to be. I want you to understand that I did not hate my brother. That's the part people never get. I loved Colton. I love him still, in the exhausted, complicated way you love a natural disaster you grew up inside of. It wasn't his fault he was born into the warm half of the house, but loving him did not make me blind, and it did not make the cold any warmer, and it did not stop me from being the one who got called at 9:52 on a Thursday night to pay for his mistakes while a room full of strangers clapped for the son my parents had forgotten they had. Here is the part that took me the longest to admit. I did it. Every time. I paid, I showed up, I fixed it. Colton wrecked his first car at 20, and I covered it so my parents wouldn't worry. Colton's first business, a sneaker resale thing, collapsed in a cloud of angry customers, and I quietly made the refund so the family name wouldn't get dragged online. Colton got engaged and unengaged, and the ring had already been financed, and guess whose credit card cleaned up the interest? I was the family's emergency fund, its cleanup crew, its unpaid crisis manager, and the compensation for all of it was a single recurring sentence, delivered warmly like a gift. You'll be fine. You always are. There was a night, and I remember it with the crystal clarity you reserve for the moments a thing inside you starts to crack. It was 2 a.m, and my phone rang, and it was Colton, slurring, stranded, 90 minutes outside the city after a night that had gone somewhere it shouldn't have. He'd left his wallet, his ride had abandoned him, there was a situation with a bar tab and a manager threatening to call the police, and he was crying, my little brother, 28 years old, and crying into the phone, and he said, "You're the only one I can call, you always fix it." So I got up, I got dressed in the dark so I wouldn't wake anyone. I drove 90 minutes on empty highways, and I paid the tab, and I smoothed it over with the manager, and I poured my brother into my passenger seat, and I drove 90 minutes back, and I